All right, so it's now time to start. So welcome to today's webinar, and the subject for discussion is what does root cause analysis mean when it comes to safety instrumented system failures? Now, some of you are probably familiar with the way that we do our webinars, and some of you are probably not. So for those of you that have been on our webinars before, please bear with me. I'm just going to do a short introduction about Exida for those that are not familiar with who we are. So Exida stands for Excellence in Dependable Automation, and the company is now in its 24th year. Next year will be our 25th year. And it was originally founded by two gentlemen. One was the customer, the other one was the supplier. And the customer wanted to have his new safety system certified to the standard that had just come out at that time in 2000 called IEC 61508. And of course, didn't pass. So when the client said to the vendor, how do we make this pass? He said, we don't do that. And that was sort of an aha moment where they figured that a lot of manufacturers would be in the same situation. And so Exida was born. And it started off just with doing product certification for safety to IEC 61508. Well, since then, we've expanded and grown exponentially. We don't just do product certification for 1508. We also do cybersecurity product certification. There's a lot more of that happening these days than before. And we do personnel certification. So you can become a certified functional safety expert or certified cyber automation controls expert, which is the equivalent. Also, we provide services. So the services are for functional safety, alarm management, and cybersecurity, because those three are very tightly coupled when it comes to overall process safety. They all have the same three phases of life cycle. They're all performance-based in terms of the analysis, design and implementation, and operation and maintenance. And so we provide support to clients in different industries for these types of requirements. We also provide the training. And then the third part of Exida is the tools side, where we're doing software development for tools to support the certification and the lifecycle services. We are now global. Our two main offices originally were in Germany and in the US, but now we have expanded globally. We've added more offices. And the thing about those three with functional safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management is what we like to call industry agnostic. You can apply it to any particular industry where either one or all of those disciplines are required. We've gone away from being just owned by the two original founders to being more employee owned. We have found out that we're the leading supplier of certification services globally, and we've got well over 100 experts now, done more than 1,000 certification assessment projects, and our Excellencia tool has modeled well over 500,000 safety instrumented functions. We also publish a lot of reference materials. I always encourage people to use our website because there's a lot of free information. These webinars, for example, are recorded as YouTube videos, and they're freely available. You can just go to the exida.com website, look under resources, look under webinars. You can see which ones are coming up, and then you can go and see which ones are archived under the different topics. The books, we publish a lot of books. These are all available through the website. And we also publish papers and case studies as well as useful information. So I always encourage people to make use of the website where possible. In terms of me, I've been in industry now more years than I care to remember. I started off in 1977 as a design engineer, doing hardware and software development for control systems, and then safety systems, emergency shutdown, fire and gas, addressable fire systems. And then stayed with a company in the UK called ICS for many years before I came over here and worked for an automation company. And about 12 years ago, I came and joined Exida. So that's enough about me. Just a little safety moment that I like to include, and this caught my eye, that on the road to success, there are no shortcuts. And when it comes to functional safety, this is very, very true. It's very easy sometimes to be tempted to take shortcuts. We want to get the project done quickly. We want to get the plant up and running as soon as possible. But what we have to remember is when it comes to safety, and specifically functional safety, which of course applies to the equipment under control, we have to remember that if we take shortcuts, we might save some time and money up front, but we could be saving up a lot of problems for later on. And we must always remember that accidents can be very expensive. Dear old Trevor Kletz, who's sadly no longer with us, used to say, if you think safety is expensive, try an accident. So, no matter how the temptation may come along, if it's pressure from corporate or whatever, we have to make sure that we don't take shortcuts when it comes to safety. Otherwise, the consequences could be very significant. So let's talk about investigating safety instrumented system failures. The 1511 standard requires us to investigate any failures in the SIS. And the reason for this, of course, is twofold. We need to know, was the failure a safe failure or a dangerous failure? And of course, we know that dangerous failures are the ones that we worry about from the functional safety point of view, because we don't want the safety instrumented system to fail on demand. Secondly, we need to know whether the failures were random or systematic, and we shall see as we go through why this is important. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to learn from any previous failures. So it's very important to understand these two things. Was it a safe failure or a dangerous failure? Was it random or systematic? And in functional safety, as some of you probably are well aware, we use probabilistic analysis. That's why we talk about the probability of failing dangerous, either as an average for low demand, or the probability of failing dangerous per hour for high demand or continuous. So why is this important? Understanding the root cause of any failure is necessary, because we need to understand what's the underlying cause of this. We need to know the circumstances surrounding any failure. What was going on at the time? What was happening to the SIS? Is it process related? Was it due to maintenance? Were we doing maintenance and somehow we caused a failure? Was there bypassing involved? So we did maintenance, we had the bypassing on, but we didn't take the bypass off. And of course, when a SIF is put in bypass, its PFD is equal to 1, because it's not going to be able to perform its function. Was it related to doing the testing itself? So these are things that we have to know and understand, because of course what we want to do is we want to reduce the possibility of systematic faults, which is the second part of it. Was it dangerous? Was it safe? Was it random or was it systematic? We need to understand that. And of course, what we need to do is reduce the potential for random faults, as well as reducing the potential for systematic. So these are things that we have to consider. And unless we do the analysis, we won't necessarily know this. So when it comes to whether the failures were dangerous or not, we know that dangerous failures will result in the SIF and the SIS failing to do its job. And oftentimes, we can only find dangerous failures by either testing through the use of diagnostics for detecting when the device has failed in a dangerous way, or for proof testing, when we're doing a proof test to try and find potentially dangerous failures. Now remember, proof testing is not to prove that the SIF works. Proof testing is all about helping us to find dangerous undetected failures that the diagnostics have failed to find. And of course, we're not going to find every single dangerous failure. I know some people seem to think that if you do a full stroke on a valve, that's 100% coverage. It's not. So dangerous failures are things we worry about. And of course, this is where our PFD average comes from, or our PFH comes from. So we need to understand, if there are dangerous failures, what was the cause of that? Was it due to a bad component, such as a solenoid? The solenoid was stuck or it failed to operate. Or was it because there was a problem with the logic? We hadn't programmed it properly, or we hadn't tested the logic properly. So we had a bad application logic. Was it a bad sensor? And so on. There can be all sorts of things that could lead to this. So it's important that we do this analysis rather than either just flipping the reset switch or just very quickly replacing a device and getting back up and running as soon as possible. So we need to understand that. Because we know that the probability of an accident is going to be related to how the SIS performs and its SIFs in particular. So of course, if a hazard occurs and the automatic protection function operates correctly, then we won't have any problems. However, if the hazard occurs and the protection function fails to operate, then we're going to have problems. So we need to know what is the probability of failure for an automatic protection function. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where our probabilistic analysis comes in. Along with dangerous failures, we need to also understand safe failures. Now, by definition, safe failures are failures that occur that results in a safe condition. This can be the result of having an unwanted trip. So even though we've failed safe and we've tripped, depending upon the process, we have to start back up. And usually starting back up, again, depending upon the process, can be potentially hazardous. So we want to avoid having unwanted trips. Or it could result in discrepancy. For example, if we have a 2 out of 3 voting system and we get a failure, we'll get a discrepancy. So if one arm of the 2 out of 3 says trip and the other 2 doesn't, then of course we've got a discrepancy and we would need to know why. Again, safe failures can also be revealed through diagnostic and testing. So we need to look at the safe failures as well, because safe failures contribute to the mean time to fail safe. So 1511 requires us to determine what the target is for the mean time to fail safe. And that needs to be specified usually by the end user to go into the SRS, because part of the design verification when it comes to SIL verification is to make sure that the SIF meets the target mean time to fail safe. And this should be something we should be measuring as well, because of course, if we're getting a lot of safe failures, a lot of unwanted trips, we need to understand, why is that? Is it because there's some underlying problem that could be systematic, for example? So let's say we have a manufacturer's device that fails in a SIF and results in a fail safe. And then a couple of months later, we have a similar failure of the same manufacturer's device in a different SIF. So we've got 2 separate failures of the same device. So what we would want to do is understand, okay, well, why is that? Is there a potential underlying systematic that we're not aware of? Are we using the device correctly? In other words, is it set up according to the safety manual? Is it suitable to the environment and the operation conditions that we're looking at? So we need to understand all of that. Now, when it comes to failures, as I mentioned, is it dangerous? Is it safe? Is it random or systematic? So it's very important that we don't misclassify failures. And a pretty good rule of thumb is unless the failure is an obvious systematic, and I'll talk about that in a minute, then we should consider it as being random until proven otherwise. So in that case I gave you earlier, where we have the two devices of the same manufacturer failing in different shifts at different times, initially they would be recorded as random failures. But then, because it's the same manufacturer's device, we would want to look and see if there's any underlying systematic. The reason why it's important to count random failures correctly is because random failures will be used in future PFD calculations or PFH calculations. And if we have low random failure rate numbers because we're misclassifying random failures, then what that will lead to is optimistically low PFD or PFH calculations. So we could be fooling ourselves into thinking we have a much more reliable device than we actually do. So we need to make sure we capture all the random failures correctly. Systematic failures. Here again, we can categorize systematic failures as being associated with the 3 Ps. This is a very simple way of thinking about it and remembering it. The first P is to do with the people. Are people properly trained and competent to do the work that we're asking them to do with regard to life cycle tasks associated with the safety instrumented system? So this is why when the standard, the 1511 standard was changed in 2016, a lot more emphasis has been placed on personnel competency and making sure that we have training records, making sure that there are periodic assessments required for the O&M people. So all of this needs to be done. The second P is procedures. So again, do we have written procedures that are being followed? Many times accidents have been traced back to procedures not being followed or violated during the startup, for example. So again, if the procedure is not being followed, either the procedure is wrong or we have to make sure that people follow the procedures. And the third P, of course, is paperwork, lack of documentation. Are we doing what we said we would do? And this can come down to design specifications. If we have a poorly written design specification, we could end up with a design that does not meet requirements. So again, when it comes to the failures in the SIS, we need to understand, is there any potential underlying systematic issue? If people aren't properly trained, they could make mistakes, for example, with calibration or setting trip points or installation and commissioning. All of those things can contribute. So we need to make sure that we can avoid that as far as possible. And this is why it's important to have a functional safety management system in place and to have a functional safety management plan, which will determine how functional safety is maintained throughout the life cycle. And part of that would be doing or performing functional safety assessments. So the functional safety assessment serves two purposes. It provides the ability to have an independent, and there's the key word, independent cross-check on safety to make sure we actually have what we need up to this particular point in the life cycle, wherever it is. And secondly, to help us spot and fix any systematic failures before they become a real problem. So this is the whole point, because nearly all accidents are the result of some systematic issue. Yes, it could be because the safety instrument system failed to perform its task, but it could be because it wasn't properly maintained, repairs weren't done effectively, we've gone well beyond useful life. In other words, we've got a run to fail mentality, lots of things, all because we didn't follow the correct life cycle method. So here's an example. In this particular case, and this was an example from a particular site where they were finding that they were getting higher failures of this particular pressure sensor. And when it was compared back to the FAMIDA results, they found it was much, much higher than it should be. So when it was investigated, what they found was that the diaphragm in this particular case, in this device, was mounted directly behind the piping connector. And when the root cause analysis was done, they found that the diaphragm was damaged as a result of maintenance. What the maintenance guys were doing, as you can see in this picture on the bottom right, they were using a screwdriver and putting it in the entry ports to clean them out and twisting it. The result of which ended up causing this problem with the sensor. So again, you could argue that that's a systematic issue because either they weren't properly trained to do that or they were using the wrong device. So that's just an example. So some of the techniques that you can use for doing the root cause analysis, here are some of the common ones. There's obviously more than just these, but fishbone diagrams are quite useful because they can help us look at multiple possible causes for a specific effect or problem. And I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with fishbone diagrams. Then there's the 5 whys, which is a very simple technique. Basically, you just keep asking why to delve deeper into the root cause of a problem. Or you can use the failure mode effects analysis, which enables us to systematically evaluate potential failure modes and effects. And years ago, in the 1980s, when we were designing safety systems at ICS, we used the FAMIDA technique to be able to come up with a reliability figure, but not only that, to use that to help us with understanding how the system would fail. And it's obviously used quite a lot in quality management and risk assessment. The technique we use here in exida is known as the FAMIDA. So it builds on the failure mode effects, but it adds in diagnostics. So it's failure mode effects and diagnostics analysis. And then another common technique would be to use fault tree analysis. So again, you can look at the various events that could lead to a specific failure. And this is also useful with safety critical systems, such as SIS. So there's different techniques you can use to do the root cause analysis. But fundamentally, this is what we need to do. Part of the problem is, and when I've talked to many end users, I hear this quite often, that production pressure, there's a need to get back up and running as soon as possible. This comes back to the slide I showed at the beginning about cutting corners. We need to make sure that if it's failed, rather than hit the reset or just rush off and get another transmitter and stick it in there or whatever it is that's failed, we need to understand what was happening, why did it fail. So when we do, for example, any of the mechanical inspections or doing proof testing, we need to record the as found conditions so that if we do detect a failure, we know what was happening before we started doing the testing. And then again, after we finish the testing, if there's no failure, we need to record the as left conditions. Very important if we're using bypassing. Make sure we take the bypass off and we put the sieve back into its normal operating state. Another thing I hear as well is, well, we have insufficient time to investigate. We don't have the ability to do that because of number one, the production pressure. And then thirdly, I've heard, well, we don't have enough people, or we don't have properly trained people who are competent to be able to do this work. So these are some of the three things that I hear very often when I talk to end users. And these are ultimately linked to the fourth point here about the site safety culture and practices. Now, there is a webinar that I did some time ago on site safety culture, but basically this will have an impact on the ability to do the proper analysis when it comes to failures. So site safety is all about the culture. Again, it has to come, culture is endemic, it has to come from the top. So if the culture is that our standard of care is very high, we take safety very seriously, we need to understand why the safety instrument system failed, if it did fail, what was the root cause. So in these organizations, you're likely to have the time and the resources to be able to do this investigation. Because it's well understood that if the safety instrument system is properly maintained, then we'll have less problems with, for example, false trips. It will reduce the maintenance because we're not having to go in there and either replace stuff or to restart. And of course, it will help maintain our risk at the desirable level. Being able to implement repairs properly is very important, and therefore they need to have the time, they need to have the training to be able to do this. And making sure that the procedures are correct and in place to be followed. This also encourages, again, from one of the earlier slides about learning. We want to be able to learn from operating experience. So we need to develop an open and learning environment to ensure that we can maintain operational and functional safety. So this is all linked back to what is the culture when it comes to making sure that we have a safe operating environment and that we are maintaining our safety instrument system correctly. Some of the consequences of poor site safety culture, I mean, you've only got to go to the CSB, the Chemical Safety Board website, and you can see many examples of this. Our SIFs will fail on demand if we don't do the proper maintenance and testing, if we don't observe the useful life and replace or refurbish the devices before the end of useful life, we could increase the possibility of having a failure on demand. So that's why if we're not able to investigate failures properly, we could have systematic issues that we don't know are there and that are going to pop up time and time again. We'll get an increase in unwanted trips. And as we've said, depending upon the process, trips can be expensive because it may take you a day to get back up and running. And plus, you've got to start up again. So this will ultimately increase maintenance costs, reduce productivity and efficiency. All of those will have a dollar impact. It will also increase the risk and likelihood of having a major accident. And like I said, if you go to the CSB website, there's lots of examples. We don't want to increase the potential for serious injury or fatality. And all of these can be the result of a poor site safety culture. So in summary then, when it comes to SIS failures, we need to do a thorough investigation. We need to understand what is the root cause of the failure, especially if it was a dangerous failure. So we need to look at safe and dangerous failures. We need to see, was it random or systematic? Remember, systematic is down to the 3 Ps. If we don't have properly trained and competent people to work on the system, then errors can creep in, systematic errors can creep in. If we don't have well-written and correct procedures, we can end up with problems there. So for example, if the calibration procedure is in error, then chances are the device is going to be configured wrong or calibrated incorrectly. And then of course having a paper trail, making sure that we are documenting everything, because 1511 is a performance-based standard. This is why in 2016 they added the requirement to perform a functional safety assessment number 4. So FSA 4 is supposed to be performed after some period of time in operation. Again, the standard does not tell you what that period of time can be, but you could use the 5-year window between doing your hazard and risk assessment re-evaluations, because 5 years is a reasonable amount of time. As long as we're not getting a lot of problems, then we should be able to gather a reasonable amount of plant data, which we can then use in the revalidation, because of course demands on the system, whether they're real or otherwise, we would be able to use that information to feed back into the hazard risk assessment. So unfortunately in the US, not many companies are performing FSA 4s. In other parts of the world, it's actually a requirement that they have to do it. But here, it's down to the end user. But it's, again, if you've got a performance-based system, how do you know you're maintaining your design targets if you're not measuring performance? So understanding the failures is also part of that, because we have targets. We have targets for dangerous failures through our PFDs, and we have targets for safe failures through our mean time to fail safe. And making sure that we properly record random failures is also very important, because those will be used in future PFD calculations or PFH calculations. Systematic errors will require eliminating. So unless we do that and understand where they are, we're not going to be able to get rid of them, and we'll just keep repeating the same problems. Functional safety assessments are there for a reason. They're there to help us be able to spot potential systematic issues and fix them before we go too far. So for example, with the FSA 2, which should be done at the end of the design phase, normally as part of FAT, factory acceptance test, because factory acceptance test is what I like to call stage 1 of validation. So that is where you bring the application logic together with the logic solver, and you do some black box testing to make sure that the SIS logic is performing correctly. So if we don't do that validation properly, we may end up with potential hidden or systematic issues in the logic, which can come back to bite us later on. So all of these things are there for a reason. And as I've said, site safety culture is also key as to whether we can be successful or not in being able to analyze and understand the root cause of any SIS failures. All righty, if there are no other questions, then I thank you all for attending. I hope you found this interesting and useful. My email's there if you have any other questions that you wish to ask. I'd be happy to answer. And I look forward to you joining us in the future on another webinar. Thanks for attending.